Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Monday the 13th of February. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 355 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will discuss today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. One person has been killed overnight after Russia shelled Kherson, and damage to railway infrastructure has prevented trains from Kyiv and Lviv reaching the city today. Russia has claimed its troops have advanced just over 1 mile in 4 days along the front line in Ukraine. Evgeny Prigozhin, the founder of Russia's Wagner Group, said the mercenary force had taken the village of Krasnohora on the northern edge of the embattled city of Bakhmut in Ukraine's Donetsk region. Ukraine's defences are holding along the front line in Donetsk, with the fiercest battles raging for the cities of Vuhledar and Mariinka, and that's according to Valery Zaluzhnaya, who is Kyiv's top military commander. An unverified video is being circulated on social media, which appears to show the murder using a sledgehammer of a second former Russian mercenary who had fled the Wagner Group. The US has told its citizens to leave Russia immediately due to the war in Ukraine and the risk of arbitrary arrest or harassment by Russian law enforcement agencies. Politico has reported that a 10th package of EU sanctions against Russia will include action against 4 Russian banks, including Russia's largest private bank, Alfa Bank, a ban on Russian nationals serving on boards of critical infrastructure companies in the EU, new sanctions against 130 listed entities and people, and import and export bans aimed at the construction industry. China has confirmed that its top diplomat, Wang Yi, will be visiting Russia this month. Russian state-owned media is reporting that Russian defense personnel are building a water pipeline system to connect Russia's Rostov region with the eastern Donbass region inside Ukraine. Russian forces are likely to have had their highest rate of casualties over the past 2 weeks since the first week of the invasion of Ukraine. That's according to the UK Ministry of Defence. Poland's President Andrzej Duda has cast doubt on whether Poland will be able to supply Ukraine with fighter jets. Iran is reported to have smuggled drones, including at least 18 of the new types of advanced long-range armed drones, into Russia using boats and the Iranian state airline. The former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi has blamed Vladimir Zelensky for the war with Russia. And the head of the International Olympic Committee has rejected Zelensky's call to ban Russian athletes from the 2024 Paris Games. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Maureen Watt, who is a retired politician and former Minister for Mental Health in the Scottish Government. Maureen served as a regional MSP for North East Scotland from 2006 until 2011, and was then a member of our Scottish Parliament, representing the constituency of Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 to 2021, when she retired. Maureen was also a teacher and a councillor, amongst many other roles. Maureen, good evening. How are you keeping?
Good evening. I've got a bit of a cold, but apart from that, I'm all right. I'll get over that, hopefully, and not splutter during the evening.
I'm sure you won't. Well, I hope you get well soon and get shot of that cold, Maureen. We'll go to our first item this evening now, because the death toll from the catastrophic earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria has climbed over 35,000 as UN aid officials push for more aid access to rebel-controlled northwestern Syria, where only one crossing from Turkey is open. As search and rescue teams began winding down their work amid diminishing prospects of recovering people alive from the rubble, the focus has turned to the humanitarian situation in Syria, where, according to some estimates, millions of people are homeless through a combination of the earthquake and the long-running civil war. At the centre of the issues compounding the crisis in rebel-controlled Idlib are the complicated arrangements for humanitarian deliveries to the Syrian region, which operates under a mandate from the UN Security Council through the Bab al-Hawa border crossing. There has long been pressure to open other crossings to reach Idlib, but such moves have been vetoed by Russia and China, who claim that it would undermine the sovereignty of the Bashar al-Assad regime in Damascus. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres was urging the Security Council to authorise the opening of new cross-border aid points between Turkey and Syria, but it was unclear whether that would overcome past objections. Before a Security Council meeting on the crisis, however, diplomats said that no draft resolution had yet been circulated. Further complicating the issue since the earthquake has been the refusal of the hardline Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham group to receive aid sent via Damascus, despite warnings that survivors living outdoors in winter conditions are facing a secondary catastrophe. Officials and medics said earlier today that 31,643 people have died in Turkey and 3,581 in Syria from the 7.8 magnitude tremor a week ago, bringing the confirmed total of fatalities to 35,224. So far, only a few dozen trucks have crossed over the Bab al-Hawa into northwest Syria, carrying aid that had already been scheduled for delivery before the quake. The Director General of the World Health Organization met Assad in Damascus on Sunday and said that the Syrian leader had voiced readiness for more aid crossings across the border. So, Maureen, firstly, it may be too early to learn lessons, but I'm wondering, is there more that can be done to help the people in Turkey and Syria from Scotland? I'm aware that there are collections in Dunelm stores across Scotland. In Edinburgh, there are a number of locations, including the Smith Place Hotel in Smith's Place. In West Lothian, Homemade West Lothian and Bathgate. In Glasgow, the Est Ethics Clinic, which is at 170 Ingram Street. In Stirling, at the My Dessert House restaurant in Upper Craigs. And in Aberdeen, at the Turkish Education and Cultural Trust, which is at 435 Great Northern Road. I also mentioned yesterday there was a collection point at the A1 car wash in Dundee. So are you hearing anything more where you are with regard to people taking steps to do whatever it is that they can help other people living in the disaster zone in Turkey and Syria?
I don't think anything more than you, Andrew, but the effort by Scots and indeed other countries, when you hear of Ukraine, almost immediately sending aid money themselves, you get an idea of how internationally countries are coming to the rescue in Turkey and Syria, which is indeed one of the worst disasters that we've had in a long time. I think all these collection points being set up often by people from Turkey or Syria themselves is great. And often that aid is then taken by people themselves across to Turkey and hopefully into Syria, as you were saying. But I think at this moment it is much better if we can open our purses and our wallets and donate money to the disasters emergency appeal so that the money can be targeted through aid agencies which are well versed in dealing with such disasters. I think the fundraising effort has been superb, something like over 60 million already in the UK, and more than our share from Scotland. So I think the UK government could step up and match fund a better amount than they have said. I think it was just 5 million. But this is something that we're hearing is going to, and we can see for ourselves, is something that's going to go on for many months. And money will be needed for a long time. So it's just awful to watch, actually, and to think that we are now moving into a period where it's recovery of bodies is unlikely. A recovery of people alive is going to happen anymore, and it's just a recovery of bodies. But can you imagine being in that situation yourself? It's just awful.
It is both the damage done during the earthquakes and the difficulties that have been encountered since, because it is the middle of winter in Turkey and Syria. I was going to ask you briefly about the issue with the border crossings. There's long been pressure to open other crossings apart from the one that there is open in order to reach Idlib, but such moves have always been vetoed by Russia and China, claiming it would undermine the sovereignty of the al-Assad regime in Damascus. Now, it strikes me that none of those regimes has a great reputation for respect of human rights. So, do you think, is there any chance that China, Russia, and Syria will change their stance on reopening these border crossings now?
Well, not only human rights, Andrew, but human life, actually. It seems cheap to Russia and many of their supporters. There is a UN envoy in Damascus and Aleppo today. Hopefully, he manages to meet up with Assad himself. And I think if Assad himself said, let's open up the borders, this is a humanitarian situation, um, perhaps China and Russia might back down. But the runes aren't really very good. And it just shows you, as I said, how life is cheap. I mean, the suffering of people already in the north of Syria has been great. And to pile this on top of that, I can't understand anybody who wouldn't want to see the border crossings opened and aid coming in as much as possible. I mean, for goodness sake, just let's forget about terrorism at the moment. I don't think anybody there is focusing on terrorism. They're focusing on survival, regardless of what side of any argument or war that they're on. And let's just help people rather than putting them in boxes and categories, and regard that as human life that needs saving in this situation.
Correcting completely. Thank you, Maureen. We'll move on to our next item, though, because the SNP Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn MP, on a visit to the St Fergus gas terminal, has challenged the UK government to put its money where its mouth is on carbon capture funding. In a letter to the Prime Minister, the SNP leader at Westminster called for immediate funding for North East Scotland's Acorn project, following continual delays from the UK government. Despite repeated promises, the Acorn project was overlooked in the Track 1 stage of funding for carbon capture sites and was instead only given reserve status. This followed a previous funding snub in 2015 when the Tories withdrew £1 billion from Peterhead despite promising the investment ahead of the 2014 independence referendum. With Track 2 funding still to be announced, Stephen Flynn has said that the time for warm words is well and truly over. The SNP has called the Scottish cluster the obvious location for CCUS, given the North East offshore industry and the importance of the technology to achieving a just transition and meeting net zero targets. Ahead of his visit, Stephen Flynn said, the Tories have failed the North East of Scotland by repeatedly breaking their promises on carbon capture funding. After withdrawing £1 billion from Peterhead, then snubbing the Acorn project in Track 1, the time for warm words is well and truly over. He went on, the UK government must finally announce funding for the Acorn project without further delay and stop holding back jobs and investment in the North East. Westminster has taken £400 billion from Scotland's natural oil and gas resources, and it's high time they gave something back. So, Maureen, when Stephen Flynn says Westminster's taken £400 billion from Scotland's natural oil and gas, and it's time they gave something back, is he right?
Well, absolutely. You wouldn't find me disagreeing with that. And it's just so wearying that the government just continues to slight the Northeast, given its track record, as Stephen Flynn has said, in providing billions through oil and gas being headquartered in the Northeast. And if there's anywhere that in the UK that's going to be the all energy capital of Europe, it is going to be Aberdeen and the Northeast, with all the expertise and the ingenuity and the innovation that happens in various locations throughout Aberdeen City and Shire. Um, to keep knocking back the Acorn project and carbon capture and storage at Peterhead, when it was one of the first to be to be brought to, to be developed seems to me just a complete slap in the face to the Northeast. And I'm sure that the people of the Northeast will let the Tories know that at the next election. But the politics of it aside, because, as you say, in order to get to net zero carbon capture and storage is something that's desperately needed. And as I say, the expertise is here. In order to keep the expertise from the oil and gas industry uh, to transition over to renewables, this is an important part of that.
Thank you, Maureen. And I'll let you clear your throat there. That's okay. Thank you. We'll move on now because the UK has suffered a loss of business investment since the 2016 Brexit referendum, worth £29 billion. That's about £1,000 per household, and that's according to a study by a senior Bank of England official. Jonathan Haskell, an external member of the bank's 9-strong Monetary Policy Committee, said private sector investment stopped in its tracks in the years following the decision to quit the EU. He said that in the aftermath of the vote, the UK immediately began to fall behind the trend of the previous 6 years and suffered much more when compared with other major industrialised economies, opening up a productivity gap that has left permanent scars. In contrast, David Frost, the UK's former chief Brexit negotiator, has urged ministers to fully and enthusiastically embrace the advantages of Brexit, portraying a private meeting of prominent former Leave and Remain campaigners to discuss how to move on from Brexit in the national interest as a plot to undermine the deal he struck with the EU. While both Labour and Tories maintain what appears to be in denial about the deepening damage of Brexit, the rest of the world now regards broken Britain as an international laughingstock, according to the SNP. The UK government are being met with derision around the globe. In the past week, countless headlines from media outlets around the world have highlighted the obvious hardship that Brexit has inflicted on the people of the UK. However, Labour's response is that they will make Brexit work. Commenting, the SNP's deputy leader, Keith Brown, said, "The world is looking and laughing at Britain. From Colombia to China and everywhere in between, they can all see what Westminster refuses to accept. Brexit has been a colossal act of self-harm, and it is getting worse by the day. The Tories have made Britain an international laughingstock, and the global derision is unrelenting. Countries that the Tories used to arrogantly dismiss as basket cases are now giving it back to Britain in spades, and no wonder. It's impossible to overestimate how disastrous Brexit has been. But the Tories and Labour refuse to admit what the whole world can see. Instead of accepting that Brexit has failed and taking the necessary steps to put right this catastrophe, both parties are negligent in denying reality and remain committed to keeping Scotland out of both the EU and the world's biggest single market." So, Maureen, when assessing the damage that Brexit has done, most studies have been looking at the UK's loss of national income, GDP, and have focused on trade. The Bank of England said that comparing the UK's current level of trade with the trajectory before Brexit in 2019, that would amount to a loss of about 3.2% of GDP. And the Office for Budget Responsibility said GDP would be 4% lower in the long run. And now we've got Jonathan Haskell saying that a private sector investment stopped in its tracks, and the loss of that business investment is worth about £29 billion. He said that in the aftermath of the vote, we immediately began to fall behind and have suffered much more when compared to other major industrialised economies. So do you think, and he said that that productivity gap will leave permanent scars on the UK economy. So do you think are Brexiteers close to getting grips with the damage that they have done? And or do you think are any foreign direct investors going to invest in an international laughingstock?
Well, I think Brexiteers are still in denial and will continue to be in denial and will try to bluster their way out of it continually. In the meantime, all of us are suffering. I remember before Brexit happened, there was a study which said in the Northeast we'd all be £9,000 worse off. And I think if a study was done now, it would be a lot more than that. And we know that previously Britain was seen as a gateway for inward investment, as a gateway into Europe. And now that's almost completely dried up. So, how we get out of this, I don't know. And I'm sure I read an article that said that perhaps the Tories and Labour were even meeting up to decide how they would best present it to the UK population in the future. But it has been an absolute unmitigated disaster. More and more people who voted for it are now prepared to admit that, but not the hardline Brexiteers of the Tory government and the Tory party. And I really do hope they are heading for annihilation at the polls, which whenever that is, and it can't come quickly enough. But whether Labour have any answers to how we turn this around, I'm not holding my breath.
Absolutely, Maureen. Thank you. Yes, you're referring to the reports of the secret cross-party meeting at the Ditchley Foundation in Oxfordshire last week, featuring such luminaries as Norman Lamont and Gisela Stewart. But we'll not drag them into this evening's conversation. Let's move on and talk a little bit about Scottish politics, if we can, because the former Blairite MP Douglas Alexander, who lost his Paisley and Renfrewshire seat to Barry Black in 2015, has been selected by the Labour Party to be their candidate for East Lothian at the next UK general election. The brother of the former Scottish Labour leader Wendy Alexander, Douglas Alexander served as a minister in both the Blair and Brown governments until Labour lost office in 2010 following the UK financial crash. The East Lothian constituency is thought to be one of Scottish Labour's top targets, as they hope to capitalise on division between the sitting Alba Party MP Kenny MacAskill and the SNP. Douglas Alexander is understood to have the support of senior Labour figures close to Sir Keir Starmer. So, firstly, Maureen, Douglas Alexander's candidacy comes more than 25 years after he was first elected to the Commons, winning the then safe Labour seat of Paisley South in a by-election in November 1997. So, are the politicians of the 20th century going to have the answers to what we need to do in the 21st century?
Well, it shows how politics gets right under your skin, doesn't it? And it's very difficult to get rid of it, even although you've been out of politics for a long time. I was trying to try and remember what he has been doing in the meantime, but whether it's an example of somebody thinking, and you make a good point about having been out of politics for so long, whether they think they can come back in and do better, or whether the Labour Party is struggling for candidates. But either way, no doubt it will make an interesting contest. The media will focus on it, no doubt. But whether they make any inroads to what will be a clear SNP Labour fight, I doubt. We shall see. But very interesting to see such a comeback.
Well, it is. And in answer to your question, he's been working for BBC Radio 4. He was the chair of the Board of Trustees of UNICEF UK until he stepped down following accusations of bullying. He's a General Court Assessor at the University of Edinburgh, and I think he was a fellow for a university in the United States. But I was also going to ask you, Mr. Alexander spent a little more than a year as Secretary of State for Scotland under Tony Blair. And I wonder, will voters nowadays be able to spot any differences at all between Douglas Alexander and Alistair Union Jack, the current Secretary of State?
Well, to be fair, I haven't heard Douglas Alexander views on anything recently. I haven't seen him on any television programs or radio programs, so I don't know what his views are currently. But the thing is that nobody other than people with a slight interest in politics will know who he is, or people of my age, perhaps. To the younger voters, he'll just be one other Labour politician, and there won't be that name recognition that I think probably he thinks that there might be. He will definitely just be starting from scratch, like any other candidate.
That's a very good point, Maureen. And before we leave, Mr. Alexander, one other question. From the perspective of the Labour Party, the British Labour Party in Scotland, do you think, is it sensible to select someone as a candidate who was the National Director of Election Strategy during a general election when he lost his own seat?
Well, as I said, it's be interesting to know whether it there was a very vibrant competition with lots of people vying for it, or whether, as you suggest, he might have just been a place person from Labour HQ. Um, the candidate is great, and that's the name on the ballot paper. It's the party that people really vote for, together with a vibrant local campaign. And will he have Labour Party support there to go out and do the door knocking and the leaflet drops that are required? So we'll wait and see. As I say, the media will likely focus on it, but how interesting it will be, we don't know.
Thanks, Maureen. Now then, Catholic clergy in Portugal have abused nearly 5,000 children since 1950, an independent commission said today after hearing hundreds of survivors' accounts. Thousands of reports of paedophilia within the church have surfaced around the world, and Pope Francis is under pressure to tackle the scandal. The Portuguese inquiry, commissioned by the church in the staunchly Catholic country, published its findings after hearing from more than 500 survivors last year. This testimony allows us to establish a much larger network of victims, at least 4,815, the Commission head, Pedro Strecht, told a press conference in Lisbon that was attended by several senior church officials. Mr. Strecht, who is a child psychiatrist, said it would be difficult now for Portugal to ignore the existence of child sexual abuse or the trauma it has caused. The head of the Portuguese Episcopal Conference, the CEP, Bishop José Ornelas, is expected to respond to the findings later on today. Faced with a multitude of clergy sexual abuse cases that have come to light worldwide and the accusations of cover-ups, Pope Francis promised in 2019 to root out paedophilia in the Catholic Church. Inquiries have been launched in several countries, in addition to Portugal, including Australia, France, Germany, Ireland, the Netherlands, and the United States. The time limit for bringing charges has already expired for the vast majority of offences recorded by Mr. Strecht's six-member commission, but 25 cases have been transferred to the Portuguese Prosecution Service. So, Maureen, one survivor who gave evidence to this commission said that the independent commission had afforded her an understanding ear and psychological support. She said it was a good first step for survivors who wanted to break the wall of silence that has surrounded them up till now. So, no doubt this is a good first step, but are the next steps coming fast enough?
No, and the fact, as you said, that some people won't be prosecuted because they're time barred is deeply disturbing, and surely governments should think about lifting that time bar where it still exists, because there's no doubt that people should be brought to prosecution regardless of the time barrier, because the trauma that it's caused the victims lives with them forever. And if they're to get some closure on this, they have to see prosecutions if they're at all possible. But the Catholic Church is very good at removing people from the scene, from the country even, and posting them elsewhere, out of what they would see as harm and prosecution's way. And I think these revelations will go on for decades and decades to come. But we can only hope. I was going to say pray there, but I don't know. We should only hope that the Catholic Church has turned itself around, because it was awful in the past. And hopefully there's nothing like this happening currently. And you would hope that there's some sort of surveillance mechanism in place in the Catholic Church to ensure that these things, horrible things, are not still happening.
No, that's a very good point, Maureen. Portugal's bishops are going to convene in March to draw conclusions from this report and, quote, rid the church of this scourge as much as possible. Father Manuel Barbosa, a senior CEP member, said last month. And what struck me from that was this qualification of removing the scourge as much as possible. Why do you think that senior church figures are still hedging their bets and are still being less than absolutely black and white, absolutely clear cut about their determination to reform the church and to end this scourge amongst the church?
I don't know why there's that qualification, and there definitely shouldn't be that qualification. I mean, there should be absolutely no barrier whatsoever to people who have been abused or the relatives on their behalf coming forward to the police and the authorities, not to the church itself, but to the police and authorities, to have allegations thoroughly investigated and prosecuted where possible. And the full force of the law is the only thing that is going to stop this horrible abuse from happening. But, there's also needs to be, long-term vigilance of people in the church to make sure that nothing untoward is happening. And the fact that you've got to, be always vigilant in the church and your religion is just doesn't bear thinking about, really.
I think that's a very fair point, Maureen. Thank you. We'll move back to North America now because the US military has shot down a third flying object over North American airspace in 3 days, as the Air Force general overseeing the airspace said he would not rule out any explanation for the objects yet. This high-altitude unidentified object, described as an octagonal structure with strings attached to it, was shot down over Lake Huron in Michigan on Sunday. It is understood to have been the same item that was picked up by radar over Montana on Saturday. At the point it was struck by an air-to-air missile launched by an F-16 fighter jet, it had been flying across the Great Lakes region at 20,000 feet, a height that could have posed a risk to civilian aircraft. I'm glad to report it has been swiftly, safely, and securely taken down, the state's governor, Gretchen Whitmer, said. The Pentagon said that the object appeared to have travelled near US military sites and posed a threat to civilian aviation, as well as being a potential tool for surveillance. 3 unidentified flying objects have now been downed in as many days, after a large balloon was shot down off the coast of South Carolina on the 4th of February. That object was claimed by China, although Beijing has insisted it was involved in innocent weather research. General Glenn Van Herk, who is tasked with safeguarding US airspace, said the military had not been able to identify what the 3 most recent objects were, how they stayed aloft, or where they were coming from. Van Herk said that the US had adjusted its radar so it could track slower objects, and that the 3 most recent objects were being called objects, not balloons, for a reason. Military personnel equipped with specialist diving gear designed for the extremely cold water of Lake Huron were expected to be deployed quickly to search for pieces of the destroyed object. So, Maureen, the growing number of incidents is raising more questions about the direction of relations between the world's 2 largest economies, especially now that the Biden administration is hyper alert about the threat it says is posed by a global Chinese military-backed surveillance program spanning more than 40 countries, although that's a claim that Beijing has rejected. China has also stepped up accusations against the Biden administration, saying earlier today that the US has sent balloons over Chinese territory more than 10 times since the beginning of last year. Over the weekend, a Chinese news outlet, The Paper, said that China was getting ready to take down an unidentified object flying over its waters near the port city of Qingdao. So, do you think, are we seeing a little local difficulty here and a media frenzy, or are US-Sino tensions significantly increasing?
does kind of border on the ridiculous, doesn't it? Especially if they're not going to be able to identify what these objects are pretty swiftly. And for relations to deteriorate on the back of this, and well, we've sent balloons, but you've sent balloons. I mean, it is absolutely stupid. And the who was the U.S. diplomat who was going to be visiting Beijing, and that was cancelled because of the first one. I mean, the sooner these visits and diplomatic relations resume, the better. Um, because I mean, this a diversion from something else? And that was always in the back of my mind when something kind of quite silly comes up like this. You know, they are obviously a danger in airspace if they've not been identified. But I think the US needs to come clean as to what exactly the ones after the first one have been, and whether they are indeed surveillance. And I can't think that China is using balloons for surveillance when there are lots more sophisticated techniques available. So, yeah, is it a diversion from something else? I worry.
That's a very good question, Maureen. I think yes, Anthony Blinken, who's the U.S. Secretary of State, was due to be in
That's the
China,
one.
and as you say, that visit has been postponed at least, if not cancelled. And yes, I can only agree. We will need to try and work out who will benefit from these stories appearing now, and that may eventually give us a clue as to who's behind this, and excuse me, and what's going on. But we'll move on now because the new National Planning Framework 4 has come into effect today in Scotland and will allow for projects to return former industrial and derelict sites to community use to become more likely to be approved. The Planning Minister, Tom Arthur, visited the £4.2 million Loch Shore development at the former Glengarnock Steelworks in Ayrshire to see progress transforming a former heavy industry site into parkland for the benefit of local people and visitors. Local authorities are encouraged to support proposals for developments that will help restore green spaces under the 4th National Planning Framework, NPF4, as part of local development plans. The policy against which planning applications will be assessed for the next decade comes into effect today. Policies in the NPF4 will also enable more renewable energy generation outside national parks and national scenic areas to support the transition away from our reliance on fossil fuels. They will regenerate city and town centres to help them adapt to economic change while restricting some of the town retail and drive-through developments. And they will support the delivery of good quality, affordable homes in neighbourhoods where people can easily access shops, schools, and workplaces within a 20-minute walk or cycle. Tom Arthur said, "The Scottish Government has supported this transformation from a derelict site which was holding back development in North Ayrshire into a significant new visitor attraction and sports facility. Our reforms represent a turning point for planning, a strong signal of support for healthier communities and prosperous local economies. They can help promote local renewal at sites across Scotland in line with the National Strategy for Economic Transformation. This framework gives local planners across the country the green light to build the fairer, greener Scotland we want to see to tackle climate change and to benefit future generations." So, Maureen, one of the components of the new national planning framework is the support of the delivery of good quality, affordable homes in neighbourhoods where people can easily access shops, schools, and workplaces within a 20-minute walk or cycle. Is that something that you think will be popular in either in where you are in Scotland or across Scotland more generally?
I think it's something that has yet to um, get into the psyche of the vast majority of the population, but I think it's a very good idea. I mean, previous national planning frameworks, thinking back, have been about the delivery of big projects, not always by government, but also by other bodies. For example, the new harbour, South Harbour in Aberdeen, was in one of the previous national planning frameworks, but was developed by the Port of Aberdeen themselves. So it's good to see that there's a more looser framework, if you like, now in national planning, and that local bodies can and decide themselves what is required uh, in their own areas, and that there is this great emphasis on climate change and moving to net zero. And the things that benefit communities are not always, trying to attract big factories or things, because they are so um, susceptible to economic changes worldwide. And I think it's much better to get this kind of organic growth from the bottom up. And it's not always based on industry. Economic growth can come from so many different sources, whether it be tourism, and as you said, creating green spaces can um, allow organic growth in, the food and drink industry, for example. So I think they're quite exciting in the way that they're being developed now, and it's good to see a focus on Ayrshire, which has fallen behind in economically in so many ways since the decline of, I suppose, the mining industry. Um, so, yeah, I think things can only look up in areas where local people can get involved.
That's a very good point, Maureen. Thank you. And one other aspect in this story, the policies will also include the regeneration of city and town centres to help them adapt to economic change while restricting some out of town retail and drive through developments. Now, I saw the centre of Edinburgh being compared unfavourably to Coat Bridge earlier this week. And also, I was talking to somebody who was bemoaning the state of Union Street in Aberdeen, although that's something that I think I've heard probably every year since I was born. But it was being restated in very strong terms. Obviously, there are significant economic changes which are driving the state and the condition of our high streets, of our city and town centres at the moment. The disappearance of department stores, for example, and the move to online shopping. So, do you think is a change in the planning framework, is that going to be enough to regenerate city centres and town centres that are clearly struggling, or is more investment from central government and local government? Is more investment going to be required as well?
But investment in what? If people are going to buy stuff that they would previously have bought in department stores and things, and don't want to go to department stores anymore and want to buy online, what's the point of investing something that, has maybe had its
Mm.
day? Although I wonder whether it might be cyclical. I think that local government, with the help of national government, needs to invest in things that people can't buy online in their high streets now. And if it means that there's a bigger cafe culture, or why aren't some community centres put into some of the department stores that are empty, so that people come in for recreation or education or whatever, and not just um, shopping. So that we need to have some attractions for people to come into the city centre other than shopping at the moment, until there's maybe a regeneration of people wanting to shop in the high street. Um, but there may be um, a space for smaller shops to come back as the department stores, if money can be spent dividing up big department stores into littler units for smaller entrepreneurs to test out the market in what they think might be sellable. Then that's the way I think should go. But just trying to force people into empty units selling cheap tat, to me, is not the way to be going.
No, absolutely, Maureen. Thank you. Yes, we need to be finding ways to attract people into into the city centres and town centres, rather than forcing them. That's a very good point. Thank you. There's another investment story, however, this evening, because investment worth £105 million has been agreed to boost the number of affordable homes in Scotland. The charitable bond programme provides loans to social landlords, with the interest then reinvested as grants into the social rented sector, further increasing housing supply. The Scottish Government previously committed to provide up to £80 million through the programme in this financial year, and today's announcement marks an additional investment of £25 million. This is on top of the £260 million investment in affordable housing that was delivered by that has been delivered by the programme since 2014. The Kingdom Housing Association will be among the organisation to benefit, with a loan enabling it to deliver more than 300 homes in East Central Scotland for mid-market and social rent. The Housing Secretary, Shona Robison, said, "I'm pleased to be increasing our investment in the innovative charitable bond programme, providing funding to social landlords so they can deliver affordable homes to benefit the local people in their communities. We want everyone to have a warm, safe, affordable home that meets their needs, and by committing additional funding to the charitable bond programme, we are taking yet another step towards our target of delivering 110,000 affordable homes by 2032. So, Maureen, it struck me just in reflecting on the story a little bit. Are affordable homes operated by social landlords, are they the way forward? Are they the best way forward, or would it be better simply to revert to investing and supporting local authorities, councils, to build council houses?
Well, I think we need both, but I think the social rented sector and housing associations have a pretty good track record on delivering affordable homes. And I think the way that they have to have some mid market houses for sale and rent, economic wise, makes it more likely that houses are going to be built. The great thing about housing associations and them building houses is that they build really well insulated, energy efficient houses. They are the area of the housing sector and the housing stock where the rating of them is much higher than private ones. I mean, I don't know what it's like in your area, Andrew, but here the private sector is only interested, as far as I can see, in building, big 3, 4, 5 bedroomed houses that appeal to only a very small sector, and certainly not those um, wanting to get on to the housing ladder. So, unless these builders are building for the housing associations, these smaller houses and more affordable houses are not going to be built. So, I think this is a good investment. The Scottish Government has a good track record for building thousands of houses every year. If it's not met its target, it nearly has met its target. Having targets is a good idea, but we still have people who are homeless and people on a housing list. So it seems that you can never build enough houses, but I think the housing association is more likely to take into account the type of houses that are needed, for example, for those with disabilities, and better access, learning disabilities and other disabilities. So, there's a degree of compassion, I think, also required in house building, and that's more likely to come from housing associations.
That's a very good point, Maureen. In terms of where I am, there are 18,000 homes being built in this constituency at the moment, and demand continues to outstrip supply. It's quite incredible. So yes, there's clearly a housing issue in Scotland, and it's probably the case that everybody needs to work together, be it third sector, be it social housing, be it the government, and be it private developers as well, in order to begin to deliver the kind of supply of new homes that it's apparent that we need in Scotland nowadays. But let's move on now to our final story, because the Scottish Government's Minister for Transport has been meeting with key stakeholders on Islay today as part of the wider consultation on the future of ferry services in Scotland. Jenny Gilruth MSP held talks with the Islay Ferry Committee to discuss Project Neptune and also local ferry matters, joining Transport Scotland officials at a drop-in session in Bamore for the members of the island community to give their views. The Minister also visited Portellen, where CMAL explained its plans to upgrade the harbour ahead of 2 new ferries entering service on the Islay routes. Ms Gilruth said, "I'm really pleased to be getting out on the Clyde and Hebrides network in person and speaking directly to stakeholders about what we can do to improve our ferry services. Project Neptune is looking at the way we run our ferry services, in particular the governance structures, and I'm keen to hear from local representatives on this matter on how they think we can improve the services they experience. We have 2 new ferries on order for the Islay routes, so I'm looking forward to discussions on bringing them into service and the work to improve harbour operations on the island. I share the desires of island communities for sustainable and reliable ferry services, and I look forward to continuing our constructive engagement on improving the delivery of future services." So, Maureen, do you think will this engagement by the Cabinet Secretary with the local committee and the local community, will that help the Cabinet Secretary understand better the impact that ferry services have on island life, in particular the effects of weather on services, sustainability of population and attracting new inhabitants, and also access to key services and businesses?
Well, I think it's great that Jenny is going out and meeting islanders herself to hear firsthand what the problems are. And I mean, I remember being on a ferries inquiry on the Rural Affairs Committee, and the needs are not as straightforward as you might think. There are so many different bodies and interests that have to be considered, as well as those that make up the ferry committees. Obviously, they have a very strong view on what kind of ferry service they need as islanders, but it also needs to take into account the needs of businesses on the island, as you say, of weather, of reliability, of tourism. So there are all sorts of competing, in many ways, interests that need to be served by the ferries. But it's good that 2 new ferries are being built, albeit not in Scotland this time. There is a need for 2 ferries to be built every year to replace the fleet, and that's going to be difficult given the current economic situation. But I think Jenny Gilruth has clearly got a handle on this, and is lobbying the finance minister for money for ferries. But I'm sure our ears will be burning as she leaves Islay today. But it will give her a clearer picture of what's happening on the islands, I think.
No, thank you, Maureen, and that's a very good point you make. I was going to ask you, we can see that, for example, the discussions that there have been over the past 2 weeks with regard to the upgrading of the A9, that one of the important considerations there is a lack of funding, a lack of finance, in particular post-Brexit, and obviously the failure to make any appreciable progress with the A96 is another good example there. So, do you think, with finance being so tight at the moment for transport infrastructure in particular, do you think is there a prospect of making significant progress over the next few years?
Well, I'm not close enough to know exactly, but I think just looking from the outside in, I think there is going to be a slowdown of progress. One of the main things, of course, is that you mentioned upgrading the harbour facilities on Islay. in the past, a lot of that would have come and be funded by EU funding or a combination, which
Yes.
included EU funding, and that's gone. And the levelling up funds, or whatever the UK government calls them now, is nowhere near what was coming from Europe previously. And in terms of the A9 and the A96, the cost of materials has just gone through the roof. And I think on
Yep.
one project I heard that there was only one bidder, and that's because companies simply can't give an accurate pricing of the materials that they require to do the job. And this is not just on road building, it's in so many things. And that in itself leads to a slowdown because, if you think privately, if you're not going to get a lot of people coming to offer, to build a new garage or whatever it is at your house, and the costs have gone through the roof compared to pre-COVID and pre-Brexit, then you're going to think twice about doing it. So there's no wonder that there's a slowdown in the economy, mainly because of the actions of UK governments and UK prime ministers crashing the economy and taking us out of Europe.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maureen. I'm afraid that is all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order to be able to continue to pay the bills. To everyone who has donated and everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter and on Facebook, and when you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you could like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Please click on the wee bell. We will be back tomorrow evening at 7 with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to say thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening, and of course I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest who needs to I hope gets rid of the cold very soon, Maureen Watt. Thanks, Maureen.
Thank you, Andrew, and sorry for coughing and spluttering through it.
Not at all, not at all. As I mentioned yesterday on the Full Scottish, on this day in 1692 there were around 500 MacDonalds scattered over the lower reaches of Glencoe. The start of the massacre was signalled by a fire lit on what is now called Signal Rock at 5 a.m. It was dark, it was snowing, and the military reinforcements intended to block the escape routes from the glen had failed to turn up, leaving Captain Campbell to make his own mark in history, largely unaided. The massacre was ineptly carried out. Some 38 MacDonalds were killed by the government troops, but the sound of the gunfire provided ample warning to most, who escaped into the winter mountains. An unknown number, perhaps twice as many, died during than died during the actual attack, subsequently died from exposure in the snow. The massacre in Glencoe has been transformed by popular history into something done to the MacDonalds by the Campbells, but it is wrong to see it just as another episode in 200 years of inter-clan cattle raiding and castle burning. The problem is that the straightforward Campbell against MacDonald interpretation lets the government of the day off the hook, which is perhaps what it intended by putting Captain Campbell in charge and letting him get on with it with no help. No, Glencoe has less to do with clan rivalries than it had to do with the government's continuing efforts to suppress the Highlands and those who lived there. The orders for the massacre were signed by a major in Fort William, but the action was authorised by the Secretary of State, Sir John Dalrymple, and indeed by the King William himself. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.